This is our 9th video in our series about building a website. Last time we looked at our menus, and we particularly focused on producing the correct HTML for our menus and doing it in a nice efficient way. So what we need to do this time is we need to first of all mark the active menu selection with our CSS. That would be quick and easy. We'll need to deal with the mobile menu display, and we'll need to handle possible submenus. So first of all, let's look at how to mark our active menu selection. This is straightforward. We used this code to produce this HTML. So what we need is a CSS entry that looks like this, and this will produce this effect. The difference is subtle, so I hope you can see it on the video, where because I've chosen to mark the active menu selection in grey as opposed to white, you have to notice that going grey. Okay, so now what about dealing with mobile menu display? Well, so far we've used the same effective display for our mobile display as for wide screens. It sort of works. We've made it small text, and we haven't got many entries in the menu, and they're not long names for the pages, but it really isn't good for bigger menus with more entries or longer names in there. Now, we have got a responsive design, so it might be nice to have a pop-up menu when it's viewed on narrow screens. So let's have a look at what we think this ought to look like. And now, in order to implement this, we'll need a menu graphic. Now, in the picture here, I've highlighted it in my browser because the browser background is white and the menu graphic that I want to use is also white, so you won't see it unless I highlight it. Now we need to include this menu graphic in our navbar, which will look like this in the HTML. However, we don't want it showing on wider screens. So the first thing we need to do is to go into our first bit of CSS and tell it that although we've got an image there, we want display none on normal wide screens, and just pretend it isn't there. However, we do want it showing on narrow screens, so what we need to do here is go into our narrow screen definition, our @media for narrow screens, and we need to tell it, actually we need to change display to block, and we actually don't want the normal menu entries showing in the normal way, so they need to be display none, but we do want them to appear when we request them by hovering over. Now I'm actually going to do it by hovering over the navbar rather than just the menu graphic itself. It makes it just a little bit easier to find the pop-up menu when we are looking for it. So here's the code we need to do to put in to make the menu entries pop up when we request it, and I'm doing this in one big hit, so we're doing a few little things in here to tell it to appear when we hover over the navbar or the menu icon, and we're also I'm also putting in here a different slightly greyed background rather than white or black, and we've got the other bits and pieces in there to shape it so that we've got a width of 80 pixels for the menu and so on. And the final result should look like this. Our final task is to style up our submenus. Well, before we can begin on that, we need to create the HTML, which we'll do via our file webpage.ini. So if we change our webpage.ini to look like this, this will create subarrays, and that will create this in the HTML for us. Now we need to style up our screen menus, and styling up the widescreen menus is the easier task. Let's start with that first. We need our submenu to be hidden in the normal instance until we hover over the relevant menu entry. But we need our first entry to display just as if it's part of the main menu. So we'll need this for our CSS, and when we've created that, it will produce this effect in our web page. That one wasn't too bad. Now let's have a look at our narrow screen submenus. Now what makes this just a little bit more complicated is that we need to deal with two hover events. So the main menu will appear when we hover over the nav bar, as we had before on the narrow screen earlier in the video, but the sub-menu appears when we hover over the inner nav bar. In order to achieve all of this, we need some first of type formatting going on to make the first entry in the sub-menu appear in the main menu, but it only comes when you hover on the original nav bar. And we need to shift stuff around, and because the sub-menu will be inheriting from the main menu, we've got to undo that inheritance and make it do what we actually want it to do. So we need some relatively complicated CSS going on in these few lines here. But once we've achieved that, we end up with our CSS looking like this, and it produces an effect on screen like this. We might choose to display things slightly differently. That's up to us. As long as we've got the principles in place, we can then choose how we want to display our menus in the different situations. However, that last bit was actually quite hard. Up until now, our videos have been pretty straightforward in the concepts they've produced, but the last step was definitely challenging. There's so much going on in terms of inheritance and certain CSS styles that override certain other CSS styles and so on. So do I really have to become a CSS guru? What about if I want to do things like carousels and things like that? It can all be done, but you've got to know what you're doing. Well, the answer to that is no, you don't have to become a CSS guru. We have one more video in this series, and in that we'll introduce a final idea to make our lives simple. Next time.